Hi, everyone. I'm going to look at my notes because I have a lot of people to say thank you to. But I'm Natasha Logan. I'm the Deputy Director at Creative Time, and I'm really happy to be. I think that is my alarm. Right on time. Anyway, I'm really happy to be in this space with you all tonight, and I think we're in for a real fruitful conversation. So I look forward to listening and learning and being in dialogue with all of y'all. So this is the third and final discussion that's part of our summit, which is called Speaking Truth. It's the 10-year anniversary this year, and it's the first time that we've done this where we've kind of taken a huge topic that we usually convene over 3 days for, over 2 to 3 days for, and broken it down into different conversations that we've been having over the last few months. And we're really thrilled to have our third and final one right here at the center. The summit itself takes place November 14th through 16th at Cooper Union. It's a couple of days full of conversation. There'll be presentations from lots of folks, including Laura Bellotti, Aruna D'Souza, Larissa Sansour, Josh Begley, Lauren Woods, Kia LaBeija, and plenty more. So I hope you'll join us. If you find something useful today, there's a lot more to come. And our thinking is that these conversations all bleed into each other to kind of unpack what is an enormous topic of speaking truth in this kind of post-truth era that we find ourselves in. Before I get to our speakers for tonight, I wanted to thank the folks that helped make the summit possible. We get major support from the Trust for Mutual Understanding, the Shelley and Donald Rubin Foundation, our hotel partner this year, Sister City. Tai can report back on how that room is. And of course, the center here for all of our support in accommodating us tonight. As you probably know, our conversation tonight will convene the folks that I'm about to introduce, talking about both practical and theoretical strategies for survival, about care that goes beyond the embodied self, about prosperity, and also making strides towards queer and trans liberation. I also want to take a moment. It's important that we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we gather. So we pay respect to the Lenape peoples past, present, and future. At this point, I'd love to welcome Ted Kerr, Malaya Mañacop, I almost got it, I know it's not quite right, John Steever, and our moderator, Tai Jacob.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Tai, and I'm moderating the panel tonight. I have experience creating conversation between people through my podcast, which is called Gender Blender, where I bring together different trans, two-spirit, non-binary, and otherwise gender creative folks together to have conversations about their art and their activism. So tonight we're going to speak about concepts of truth and how they pertain to health and gender. And I'm going to get each of the panelists to introduce themselves to you with my first question for them, which is how they understand a practice of health and healthcare and healing work to be part of their work in a broad sense. So Malaya, would you like to start?
Sure. Hi everyone, my name is this on? Okay, sorry. Hi everyone, my name is Malaya. I use she, her pronouns. And the question is how does health and healing...
Yeah, I'll ask it again. So how do you understand health and healthcare and healing work to be a part of your practice?
Sure. So I moved to New York to go to grad school at NYU. I got my master's in social work. And so I come from a mental health background. But I also moved to New York after I was living in San Diego for college. And when I was 20 years old, I was diagnosed with HIV. And so that was like how I entered the healthcare system. And so also I knew in my work as a social worker that I wanted to continue doing that work. And so really all of my work is centered around being a queer, trans person of color living with HIV. And so, you know, I choose to continue working and serving my community. I also am Filipina, so I identify as an Asian American, Asian Pacific Islander, and I organize within those communities as well.
Hi, my name is John Steever. I'm in pediatrics in adolescent medicine at the Mount Sinai Adolescent Health Center up in the Upper East Side, and I'm our director of special programs, and I run our HIV positive program. I run our HIV at risk program, so the PEP PrEP program, and I run our LGBT health program, which all sounds way more official than it is. And I came to this work probably about 15 years ago. I trained in Los Angeles working with street youth at the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles's high-risk program, and just sort of kept working with population, came to New York, and now I'm sort of running the show at where I'm at. I'd like to be running the show, but I'm not. But for the Adolescent Health Center, I do the trans and HIV work, and sometimes those two programs obviously intersect. I just really enjoy working with that group of people. There's so much sort of need there, and they're often not heard. And so it's much more interesting to me than, say, working with a teenager who just needs a referral to dermatology for acne. So that's me.
Hello, my name is Ted, a former teenager who needed a referral. I'm Canadian, so if I say some words that sound funny, that's why. I'm going to get red because I care about this stuff. It's just like everything I care about coming from my face, hence the need for dermatology. And for me, this question of health is interesting. It's important for me to say from the beginning that to me, health is not the opposite of sickness. Whoa. Hello. Should I start again? No. It's important for me to start by saying that health is not the opposite of sickness. I think of them as being actually friends and living alongside each other. And part of being raised in Canada, and maybe people who are raised here or in other countries have this experience too, I learned a lot about the social determinants of health, which are all the factors that impact how and why we have health or have illness and what those experiences are. And so it's interesting to be in a room with a disco ball and think about how that is part of the social determinants of health. Like, what does it mean to be able to see yourself reflected back in a community, right? And so I've been doing that through art and culture for the last 15 years at the intersection of AIDS and art. And I did it a bit in Canada at an AIDS service organization. And then I did it here in New York at Visual AIDS, which is an organization that uses art to tell the world that AIDS is not over. And now I do it as a teacher and a writer and a co-founder of this collective called What Would an HIV Doula Do?
I have a question specifically for Malaya. I know that you work from a healing justice framework, so I was wondering if you could speak more to what that framework means, and if the other panelists have responses after, that would be great.
So yeah, I forgot to include in my introduction that I am the care coordinator at Callen-Lorde for our Health Outreach to Teens program. So it's our youth adolescent program where we serve young people ages 13 to 24. But also before, I used to be in private practice as a therapist. And before that, I've just been more in community organizing spaces. And what I've learned is that people who do organizing work, it really impacts their mental health. And so, you know, I think in the work that I do, I like to come from a place of like the things that I learned from social work school, like anti-oppression theory. And then outside of social work school, I learned about anti-racism and anti-imperialism, and just how the world has become how it is today. And so like healing justice for me is taking a look at the people who are oppressed and different cycles of oppression, and finding ways to make healing accessible to all. When you talk about like climate justice or like trans rights, like it's just really like doing what we can to make it equitable. And for me, like mental health is a huge aspect, I think. And I don't want to speak for everyone living with HIV, but I think my experience and the many people that I've met, mental health has really is just like a huge aspect to living with HIV. It's like, yes, you have your meds, you can take your meds every day, you get on treatment, but also like how you're isolated and how you're not able to, because of the stigma, you're not able to share your story with everyone. It becomes very self-isolating until you meet other people like you and you can talk about what that process and journey has been like. Yeah, so I guess, yeah, even for like, so I've been transitioning for like the past year and a half, and even that has been its own journey as far as like the people who I go to for emotional support. I have my trans mother, I have my trans sister sitting in the back. And it, you know, I didn't know how important that was to transitioning. And I was lucky to have been working in a place where I worked with queer and trans youth. And so it was very supported and everyone just really appreciated my transition. And I know that's like a really rare gift and not everyone gets that to have that experience. I kind of went on a tangent, but yeah.
If you want to.
I mean, I think one of the things that I think is really important is, you know, you're right that a lot of what should be done is it's not just an absence of illness. It's helping people, and we talked about this on the conference call, about helping people thrive. And a lot of times, thriving is different things for different people, and you've absolutely need to get rid of the sort of cookie cutter approach to an individual person, and kind of, you know, see where they're at so that you can work on the things that are not only important to them, because that's why they're here to see you, but also you start to blend in some of the things that like I may think is important for a person, but it is really important to sort of listen to the person in front of you and help them, you know. And so if the most important thing that you deal with on a visit is like helping with I don't know, something really simple like helping a family negotiate pronouns, you know, because a lot of times I'll see a parent and a child together, and so sometimes even just doing that, and we don't even get very far with the visit, like that is useful. And so I think when you talk about illness and you talk about helping, it's important to remember like where is a person coming from and starting there as your jump off point to what do they need to do well.
Yeah, that sounds like health justice. I like that as an idea of health justice. With what would an HIV doula do? It's not the greatest name, but I like saying it. Maybe a lot of people in the room know that historically a doula is somebody who helps somebody with childbirth. It goes way back, way back. And then in the last few decades, a doula is somebody who also participates in abortion, participates in end of life, participates in gender, participates in other things. And I went to seminary and I kept on hearing the word doula a lot in seminary because it's a Greek word. And I was thinking, oh, well, what would a doula for HIV do? And so I invited a bunch of friends to come and we had a conversation, and we realized that what all of those roles a doula has in common is that you're holding space during times of transition, whether it's birth or death or gender. And HIV for us is a series of transitions that start long before you might take a test and long after you might be on medication, whether you're negative or positive. And we think of ourselves not as a frontline organization who are helping, you know, there's lots of good services in New York City, so we're not doing that kind of work. What we're doing is like cultural holding space as we go through a transition time. We're trying to think of how do we reduce the harm of HIV? There's lots of ads that say things like end AIDS or, HIV is over. And it's like, but nah, it's not. And what does that kind of language do to people living with HIV? And so we want to make a world where when you get a diagnosis, it's not harmful, or it can be as less harmful as possible. And so that to us is health justice, to think about what does it mean to live with illness powerfully and not with stigma.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was amazing. So we've spoken a little bit about health. Another one of the thematics for this conversation is this thematic of truth. And so I'm wondering what, to you three, what the thematic of speaking truth means to you and how it shows up in your practice as healthcare providers, caretakers, and healers. And you can go in any order.
I mean, I think it's sort of easy from my perspective in some sense, because speaking truth often involves having potentially sort of difficult conversations with people, that you are going to talk about difficult things that they may, not necessarily want to talk about right away. So talking about some of the stigma of the illnesses that I see, talking about the reality of when a person is just starting their gender transition journey, and that it is not as simple as the movies would portray, or as easy, that there's a whole lot of things that come up. And so to be able to sort of put sometimes a break and to speak like, we need to really talk about, what does this mean? This is like, sometimes I'll say, this is puberty all over again. And the first time you did puberty, that was like 5 years. And so you're not going to wake up tomorrow and no one's going to recognize you. It's going to take a process. And so there is, I think, some uncomfortableness to that at times, but that's kind of part of my job. So yes, I'm supportive of people and I'm trying to meet them where they're at, but it is part of what I do is to say, let me show you how I've seen this work and the reality of some of the challenges that you're potentially going to have. So, but that's I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. So.
Okay, I have a few stories in mind. I'm like, where do I start? So I think, okay, I'll start with one story. The last agency I used to work at was called the Hedrick Martin Institute, HMI, another queer trans youth organization. It's more of a after-school program. And so when I was working there, I ran an internship called Community Promise. And it was an internship program specifically for young people living with HIV. And so my goal and my role there was to recruit young people who wanted to share their stories in pamphlets. And that's like a really brave thing to do, especially if you're really young. And then their goal was to share their stories with the mass membership of everyone else who went to HMI. And so that was by organizing events like on National HIV Awareness Days. And I think in that process, the 4 or 5 interns that I recruited were like, just spoke time and time again how helpful that weekly group was for them, because we did our weekly check-ins, and that was like, they always shared like how that was like one of the few spaces that they were able to talk about like their challenges with getting their HIV meds, or just the stigma that they would face like being on Grindr, on dating apps. And then so like during those National HIV Awareness Day events, they would also host panel discussions like we're at right now, and they would get to share their stories. And for me, I think like healing happens when you're able to share your truth and share your story in such a bold way. And something you said also reminded me of when I was transitioning at HMI, and one of my coworkers was just asking me like, "Oh, hey Malaya, so how's your transition going?" And I always like, that was always a really challenging question because it was a really challenging time, and I tried my best to be honest, and just tell him like, it's going, but I've been experiencing some challenges, and I wanted to like be honest with him, and then he didn't really want to hear my truth, and instead was like, oh, you know, I think it's so great that you're able to transition today, and there are people in media, and like just really what's the word I'm looking for, invalidated what I was saying. And then I was like, I no longer wanted to share my story with him. Um, and so I think in that, I like the message I'm trying to get across is, um, I guess like what I learned in social work school, like what it takes to become a good social worker, to become a good listener, is to be able to hold space for whatever truth, whatever story is being shared, um, no matter how challenging that is, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Just providing that space for someone to share that. That's all I have to say.
I think what's powerful about your story is the idea of like our truths are also our choice. We don't owe everyone our truth or our story, right? Like I'm HIV negative, but I'm aware that when people living with HIV disclose, or when someone is trans and they disclose, telling the truth can have shitty consequences in our world, right? So the truth doesn't always set us free. Sometimes it endangers us. So I just want to put that into the room because I don't want to.
There's like a time and place for everything.
Yeah, I think so. And I think part of our job as a community is to make a world where people can tell their truth, but I don't think we're there yet with lots of things. And so that's something that I think about, and also like how stories are really important, and we need to make more space for more stories, and we all have to have a better and bigger capacity for the truths we can hold, right? Like we need to hold that my truth of this room is not going to be the same as somebody else's truth of this room, and that's fine. And I think that's something I struggle with when speaking truth to power. Truth is a very scary word to me. Yeah.
So I have a few interesting things I think that came up between what all of you three said, but let's start with this concept of speaking truth to power. So we spoke about this, the three of us, prior to this panel, where my experience in activist and organizing spaces is we often hear this notion of like speaking truth to power, this idea that if from the margins we speak our truths to the mainstream, that something will change. So I want to know how that comes up in your practices, and if there are any ways that you might find it limiting, which I think, Ted, you already started pointing to ways that might be limiting.
I can take a turn going first. And I have images. Okay. So one of the things that What Would an HIV Doula Do does is we curated an exhibition here at the center called Metanoia, Transformation Through AIDS Archives and Activism. And something, that's a different one, but you'll see it in a second. Next one maybe. Oh, there's Malaya. Okay, so this is good. And something that was really important to us is that, people tell the truth all the time. People tell their stories all the time. And part of what I think of as a doula's job, or an HIV doula's job, or a culture doula's job, is to make sure that the stories that were told from the margins or that didn't get heard keep on getting brought back and dragged into the future, because it's often we only tell the mainstream stories, or the stories that reach the top, right? Like we're only watching Friends. We're not watching other great shows that we could be watching from the 90s. And so what was super important for us is that because of what we're talking about here, it's really important to know that up until 1993, women, cis women, and trans people across the board could not get a definition, could not get defined as having AIDS. So somebody could be diagnosed as having HIV, but until activism happened to change the definition of AIDS, women could not get the resources they needed. They couldn't get on trials to get on possible medications, and they couldn't get the supports that they needed, which meant that sometimes after they died, their families didn't get the support that they should have had. There was just all these things, and it was people like Katrina Haslip, who was a jailhouse lawyer, who from Bedford Hills Prison worked to help change the definition of AIDS to ensure that women living with HIV were part of the definition. And if you go to the next photo, there's also Joanne Walker, who was a woman who was living in prison in California with HIV, and she was seeing her sisters dying of AIDS in prison, and she knew that that was wrong, and so she was fighting for compassionate release for people living with HIV in prison. And these two women, we don't know their stories, right? Like, we can say Larry Kramer 100 times, but why don't we say Katrina Haslip 100 times? Why don't we say Joanne Walker 100 times? And I think that is part of like what an HIV doula does, is like we put up that exhibition, we created a catalog, we put it on social media, and then we kind of empower y'all. And we show pictures during events, and we hope you take pictures and put them on the internet. Like that is one of the things that we do to kind of open up the conversation.
I think speaking truth is can be incredibly powerful, but like I said, sometimes there is a time and a place for some things. I'm not going to encourage my kids who may not pass as well as some of the other kids. I'm not going to encourage them to go, tease the construction workers at the end of the street a little bit, because that's not safe for them. I'm not going to encourage somebody to, who has said to me, well, once I start testosterone and I start developing facial hair, I'm probably going to have to leave my house. And I said, why? And I said, well, because my father will kick me out. And I said, well, it's October. This is all going to happen in the middle of winter. And this is not, the safest thing, because you'll be on the streets in New York in the middle of winter. And so as much as I appreciate and, admired this person's like, I'm doing this, it was also a little bit of like, let's think this through a little bit. Let's be mindful so that you are not on the streets for this. So I do think it's important in like my clinic, in my exam room, I listen, I hear what people have to say, but I also want to give them a little bit of a truth that sometimes the rest of the world, and it's not like they don't know this, but I have to remind them the rest of the world may not be quite my exam room, my clinic, and so we have to have a little bit of, okay, let's, safety first, be careful, things like that. So encouragement, but a little bit. So I'm going to come across as the conservative of the bunch, I think.
Yeah, I think going off what Ted was sharing, when I was 20 years old and learning how to come to terms with living with HIV, I think I didn't have many peers to go to at the time. And in fact, in San Diego, there was this group called San Diego Young Positives. And I think it was created like during the AIDS crisis. And so has been around for a while. But most of the people in that group were older gay men. And so I was like, where are all the young people? And I asked some of the people that, and they said, like young people don't really show, or the people in this group have just gotten older, and so and have stuck around, and so I found that to be a huge need in my community, and then over time, like when I moved to New York, I realized it was the same thing. There was another HIV positive meetup group, and there's just that generational divide. I think to be a young person living with HIV now is a very different experience than what it was like to be HIV positive during the epidemic. I mean, it's still happening, but during the crisis in the 80s, 90s. And I guess where I'm going with that is like those like first few years, I didn't really know how to share my story. I didn't know how to tell people like what was the most challenging thing for me. And over time, through sharing my story with my friends, I think that's where I like gained that practice. But I think I learned a lot, and I was like, people are not talking about U equals U. They were only talking about PrEP. And even then, like when PrEP was approved by the FDA, it was approved the summer after, or the same summer that I was diagnosed. And people were at that time just like debating, does PrEP really work? Is it even real? Like, should I get on PrEP? And like the science behind it, everyone was like, PrEP works, and you should get on it if you put yourself at risk. But then I felt like PrEP took the spotlight, and there were not a lot of voices of young people living with HIV who were in a way being silenced or just not being heard. And what PrEP means for young people living with HIV, that like, you know, this is an opportunity for HIV negative people to like join and stand in solidarity with people who are HIV positive. But I think it was a missed opportunity, and like not many people really like took that on. And I can say the same, like I think I'm getting off topic, but I think when it comes to like challenges with sharing truth, I agree that it just needs to be done in many spaces. And another example, where I work at Callen-Lorde, one of the largest trans care providers in New York City, we were having a meeting full of medical providers, and there was a discussion about like trends happening in the community. I was the only trans woman of color. No, I was one of 2 trans women of color in that room, but like discussions are happening in our circle of friends and our networks that like one of the standard T blocker, spironolactone, is like bad for your body, but it's the standard that everyone is prescribed. And so like these discussions that are happening that like there are alternatives that you can take are not really happening in the healthcare setting. And it was just a weird place where like I needed to speak that truth. Otherwise, like, where would we go? And I just found myself to be in that position where I was just like, if I don't speak my truth now, then maybe I won't have the opportunity later.
Thank you all. So a little bit more on the theme of speaking truth, especially comments that you made, Malaya, around the work that you've done with young people living with HIV, and the way that specifically like at that weekly drop-in group that people were like, this is so important for us. I'm wondering about your experiences with community space as a space of truth building.
What I've seen, so now I sit in on our trans feminine group and our trans masculine groups, and just to observe and help facilitate. And I think naturally the challenge is like the young people bring a lot of trauma into the room, and someone has to hold that space. And I think it's also like another thing is just like mutual benefit, how the young people can lean on each other for support. But sometimes it's challenging to straddle the fine line of like, is this discussion damaging and harmful, or is this discussion like productive? And how do I like facilitate that discussion to be, and also like not every discussion has to be wrapped up at the end with a bow. Like it doesn't have to end on a positive note, but how do we foster learning instead of just sharing pain and it not really going anywhere productive?
Or Ted, like, how do you see the community that the HIV, what would an HIV doula do, also being like building a community of truth building?
Oh, that's interesting. So we used to meet monthly, and it would be around a topic. We started meeting, I don't know if people know the story of Michael Johnson, he was a young man who was originally sentenced to prison for 33 years on inhumane HIV criminalization laws. And we started meeting around that time, so we would educate ourselves on like, what is HIV criminalization? How can it be stopped? How can we help Michael? How is it connected to Black Lives Matter? How is it connected to the HIV world? And you know, for a few months, the meetings were really good, and we had a lot of people coming. And then something kind of interesting happened. I looked around and I was like, oh, everyone's HIV negative. Like, people living with HIV are not getting what they want or need out of this, and it's becoming like a support group for HIV negative people. And I think that's probably a really valuable thing, but I'm not interested in hosting that, and I don't have the skills to host that. And so now the model has changed a bit, and it's about like finding activities and then meeting around the activities and figuring out who are the people in the world who have money or access to resources that we can use to pay or empower people living with HIV who can then build a program that would be interesting for them to do. So we did 2 different writing groups, one with Timothy Dwight, who brought history and contemporary relationships to HIV together, and that ended up fostering like that kind of spirit of what would an HIV doula do, where people could talk about dragging the stories from the past to the present in relationship to race and HIV. We're doing something right now with the Queen's Museum where there's going to be this beautiful exhibition on Nicholas Mufraj, and we're figuring out, like, he died in 1985, and he wasn't an AIDS activist per se, but he did have HIV in his body, and so that virus that was in him is going to be in people who are experiencing the exhibition. So how do we create a guide or a museum experience that says, hey, you and Nicholas have something in common, it's inside of you, and it's really amazing, right? So we try to think of like, how do we build community maybe less in a room and more in the mind or in the heart, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
And John, I'm wondering how maybe a space even like the waiting room of your clinic might also become a community space where truths can be built or shared.
My waiting room sort of becomes sometimes an informal support group. A lot of my kids come on the same day. They start to learn who each other are. And we have a formal support group as well. But just sometimes while kids are waiting for me, they spot each other and they start talking. And the doors are fairly thin, so I can hear kind of what's going on, and hearing people talk to each other in a way that I don't think they realize that I'm listening, and hearing their stories and hearing their experiences for me is a powerful thing. It helps keep me honest about the work I do. So, you know, even though I am not I'm not a person of color, I'm not a person of trans experience, it keeps me honest with my work with those kids, taking some of the developmental stuff of adolescence into play. And so sometimes there is truth there is honesty, sometimes there is mythology, sometimes there is urban legend. I'll challenge you a little bit that spironolactone is not quite the evil medicine that you made it out to be. It may not be for everybody, that I get, but my role is, I think, to try and sometimes to temper some of those conversations. And I do find it, though, powerful when some of my kids I know are sitting in the exam room and maybe their first time, and they're seeing other people and able to share their stories. And whether it's, you know, quote, factually perfect doesn't really matter. They are sharing their experience. And that's the thing that I really like and I think is very powerful.
Do panelists have any responses, or shall I move to the next question?
Can I just shout out, can we go back to the other photos? I want to talk about this exhibition, which kind of brings together some of the stuff that we're talking about. And Dia's actually in the audience who helped organize this. This was an event we did on the High Line during the month of Stonewall celebrations. It was the 50th anniversary. And so in 1994, ACT UP created a poster or a handout as part of the parade that said, how many of us will be alive for Stonewall 35? So 1994 was leading up to the 25th anniversary of Stonewall, and ACT UP was like, listen, like we're dying at high rates. How many of us will be alive in 10 years? And after that, life-saving medication was introduced, and the story of HIV has changed for some people. And what we wanted to do for Stonewall 50, working with the High Line, is think about like, how can we build off that question that both honors the question that was asked, and also names that not everyone is there yet, and that we want more, that it's okay to want more than survival, and maybe we're allowed to want more than survival right now. So we asked the question, how many of us will be thriving for Stonewall 50? And what was really amazing is hearing John talk about the waiting room is like, I do think that those places where you just find people brushed up against each other, magic happens. So there was all these tables, and people were brought together, and there was just these facilitated questions where they had to answer really broad questions like, how do you define thriving, like good luck, and then how do you what do you want the world to look like in 2069? And in between those questions were really amazing performances by poets who kind of like charged the space, and it was kind of almost like a culmination of many of the things that we're talking about, like sharing stories, this waiting room idea, speaking truth to power, but also getting to use your imagination and your heart together. Yeah.
Thank you. So something that I also think ties a lot of your work together is a theme of transition. I think that all of you do work where you help to hold space for and facilitate transition. So like Malaya, your work holding space for the social transitions of the people that you work with, or John, your work where you hold space for the medical transitions of trans people that come into the clinic, and Ted, your work with What Would an HIV Doula Do, where you speak about how doulas hold space for multiple transitions. And what I also love about the work that you do with that piece in particular is the way that you think of transition not only as an individual experience, but as an experience that takes place within a community, where the community transitions. Malaya, you speak about how your transition was held by your community, like you were able to do it because of your trans family. Or even with what would an HIV doula do, where you also hold space for societal transformation so that people are more able to live powerfully with illness. And so I'm wondering how you hold space for transitions as creatives, as artists, as activists, as organizers, as healthcare providers, as caretakers, and as healers.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the work I did when I was a therapist was supporting people through really challenging life transitions, whether that's what it's like to be between jobs, what it's like to be going through surgery. A lot of the clients that I had were trans, and some of them were well into their transition and have like well adjusted, and some of them were like really just coming to terms with it, and I found it to be like an honor to be working with them during that time, and to really just like be that person to share what was on their mind with. Also, I mean, I always give credit to Ted for like his work with What Would an HIV Doula Do, because for me it's like I do wish I had someone there along with me throughout the process. I think my friends can serve as like people who did that for me, but I think leading a team of case managers who support our young people through finding housing if they get kicked out of their homes, or just happen to be marginally housed. They do like really amazing work with their young people. helping them get insurance, helping them plan for surgery. And I don't think my case managers realize it, but they do doula work as well. To get back to your question though, I think transitioning, what a lot of people don't understand is that like transition happens all the time, and it doesn't have to be during your transition from one gender to another. And that it kind of never ends. Like right now, I'm in transition right now with not just my gender, but also like my creativity and wanting to explore more of that. Realizing that all I've ever known was like school or work, and now I'm like wanting to just open my mind to like finding time to do other things. And so I think for me, I don't know, transitioning, everyone's always in transition in a nutshell.
I was going to say, I can't agree with you more, especially if you work with young people. You realize not only you're dealing with evolving identities in sort of multiple aspects, but you're also literally dealing with the development of the brain. And so the ability to think, going from somebody who thinks concretely to abstractly, and not all at once, right? It's in fits and starts. Parts of an adolescent's head will be like thinking, great abstract thoughts, and then part of it is literally like concrete stuff, which sort of drives us crazy in the field. But the point being is that when you've got change like this, we forget. I mean, everybody here is like an adult. Probably the youngest person in here is like 20 or so. Skate on thin ice here. But the point being is, I often see as adults, we forget how easy, we forget how difficult it is to be growing up. And so you can have an illness like HIV, and when you are first diagnosed, this is very powerful and very stigmatizing. And yet some of it is time, but some of it is also development. And as the person goes through their adolescence, young adult, and you understand what this is, the things that you need change. And what I'm trying to get around to saying is sometimes when you're dealing with a young person, they need housing, something really simple. They need a Metro card. This is not a difficult topic, but when you throw that need for a Metro card on top of I'm dealing with HIV and I'm a teenager in this clinic, that's actually a huge challenge. And so people should not forget that little stuff can make a huge impact, and not forget later in life that, I wished I'd really had somebody to wish I'd had somebody like this, wish I'd had an HIV doula when I was first diagnosed. Well, that's you as an adult saying that. The 16-year-old is like, fuck no, I don't want to talk to this. I don't want to talk to these people, right? And so something like HIV, which is so often, very stigmatizing, but it's also very hidden, is different when we're talking about holding space for transition than being trans, which has a much more visible outward appearance, where you will get people who say odd things like, so how's your transition today? Sort of like weirdness, whereas people don't really say, so how's your HIV today? I mean, it's a little strange, right? And I've definitely got off topic there, but I think, I just want to, I guess my point really is, not only are we dealing with transition of a variety of things that people do, and but also literally the brain is growing and developing, and throwing that onto the conversation is important as well. So I'd like to think that my work and my clinic staff, we try very hard to hold that remembrance that people are literally developing in a space, and that can be a real challenge for us as adults. We forget.
And I think that's a nice, generous thing we can do for each other too, is that change is a process and transition takes time, especially from ideas, right? Like the things I know about the world now, to your point, are different than when I was young. And I'm smarter about some things, thank God. In terms of HIV, I'm an optimist. Like there's about to be more people living with HIV on planet Earth than have ever died with HIV on planet Earth. And that is a huge transitional moment for us. And I think that should be a moment of great change in how we even conceive of HIV. There was this amazing woman named Bryn Kelly whose life ended too soon, and she talked about HIV as a superpower. And she would write about it as having tiger's blood, and you are part of the chosen one, and you are connected. That virus connects you to Foucault and Freddie Mercury and Cookie Mueller and Magic Johnson, and so this is this amazing thing. And I think that we are in a moment of cultural transition around HIV. When I was in my 20s, no one talked about HIV. It was something that you couldn't bring up with older people because everyone told you that they were traumatized, and you couldn't talk about it with younger people because you would out them and it wasn't safe for them. And that has changed now because of culture, because of TV shows like Pose, or because of movies like United in Anger. And I think our job as people in this room is to like animate that cultural work. And so that I think within 5 years we can get HIV less stigmatized. In 10 years it can be much less stigmatized. And so it doesn't hold this kind of like charge that it does right now.
Okay, so I want to talk more about societal transition. And I want to do it through a question of how we speak about and how we practice survival, liberation, and thriving, and how that becomes a part of your practice as healthcare providers and healers. So can you speak to that? Like how that work becomes societal transformation or societal transition?
I mean, I think first I want to speak more as like an individual, and I guess just like my whole journey of like everything that I've gone through, and you know how that I couldn't have like come to where I'm at now without the support of my community, without my family, without my chosen family, all my loved ones. And I think we're living in like a really crappy time, and I don't need to tell like I don't need to repeat everything that's happening in the world right now for that to be true. I think it's like what I know right now is I try my best to not let that get to me, in order for me to continue thriving, because it can get overwhelming, and it does get to me. I'm not perfect, but I don't let that get in the way. And so what I choose to do is to focus on myself, focus on the people I love, and my communities that I care about. I think liberation work is challenging. I've heard liberation is a lifelong struggle, that we may not see the change that we want to see in our lifetime, but at least we know we're doing it for the people who come after us. Yeah, and also like really great things are happening in the world, and people choose not to see it, or people don't give credit where credit is due, because I don't know, I think there are a lot more resources. I mean, as much as like I can always complain like we always have more work to do, I think it's just beautiful to see. It's beautiful to see me in spaces where I do have resources and I can help support others, and help continue doing the work. And whether that's like for me and like my own like self-gratification, or for my own like to feel like I'm doing meaningful work, I know it's not just for me. I know it's like for people who need that help too.
Yeah. I never wanted to be a politician, so I don't look at societal change. I'm not out there making policies to fix the world. My goal, if we're talking about societal change, is really by example, so that I have a waiting room that has I share a waiting room with multiple other providers, some of whom see teenagers with HIV, some of whom see teenagers who are transitioning, but there are also a large number of cisgendered girls coming in for a birth control refill. That's just the nature of our clinic. And so part of my way of changing the world is to show not only my colleagues, but also the other people in the waiting room that I'm going to call in somebody into my office and greet them with, a smile, a hey, how are you? How's it going? Sort of thing, that I'm turning it into the normal. Somebody asked me earlier about why did I get into what I did, and when I was an intern, part of what I wanted to do was I wanted to make it so that if you came to my clinic, it was almost a non-issue whether you were gay or straight or what. I was going to ask you who is your partner, and the answer was going to be the same. So to some extent, it's by example, and it's by normalizing things. I'm reminded of one of the things that the hospital, when they talk to the medical students, they have a course called Art and Science and Medicine, blah, blah, blah. And they had a trans person talk. And it was a trans feminine woman. And she said, one of the things that bugs me is when I go to the doctor and I have a sore throat and they want to do like a genital check. And so I was always sort of reminded, I thought that doesn't really happen in this day and age, until I've sort of seen it with my own eyes. And it even happened last week when literally one of my kids had come back from surgery, and I hadn't seen her in like almost a year. And she's sitting there with her mother, and they said, well, don't you want to see the doctor's work? And I was like, no, I don't. That's not needed at all for this visit. Like, is there a problem? Is there a complication? Is there something I should look at? No, we just thought you might want to see the surgeon's work. And I was like, no, that's not part of this visit. I know. It was like, what? And it was like, I need to keep demonstrating not only to my colleagues, but also sometimes to my families, what is normal. And for me, hopefully if I do this enough, that'll be the societal change, because I'm like I said, I'm not a politician. I'm not going to make policy. All I can do is sort of try and lead by example. So
I went to seminary, so the word liberation is like really exciting for me. I went to study Christian ethics and HIV because I wanted a different framework to think about HIV. I was thinking about it through the lens of art, and I wanted to think about it through the lens of religion, because in the United States, to talk about HIV is to talk about the church, I think, in many ways, and that's another panel maybe. But the most powerful thing that I got from seminary was to learn about liberation theology. And I think we probably all have different relationships to whatever God might mean to people, but this sentence is really powerful to me, this idea that God is always with the oppressed, or power is always with the oppressed. And I find that to be very powerful in these times, and in all times in American history, to be quite honest, because it reminds us that there are more of us than there are of them. And when we come together and we pool our resources and our brilliance and our love, that we have done, we will do amazing things. And that's what it means to gather in a room. That's what it means to have, a Creative Time Summit, is to get a bunch of brilliant people in a room and to start to share resources and social media links and to change the world for the better. So liberation to me is like this is liberation work. Yeah.
Does anyone have final thoughts that they want to share before we open up to audience Q&A? Okay.
I want to hear what people have to say.
Okay, so before we open up to audience Q&A, I'm just gonna share some of the themes and insights that I've pulled from the panel, and hopefully that will get some of the juices flowing in the room so that people are ready to ask questions that might pertain to what I've talked about and that might even go beyond it. But something that I noticed in the discussion today is the importance of community space for healing and for care and for creating truth and for telling stories. And I'm thinking about the way that community space can exist, like Ted, you said, gathering in a room, or Malaya, you speak about creating a family, how these community spaces can actually work to change the narrative and to recreate what we think truth can be. I like to think of truth not simply as facts, but as like as the work of liberation and as the work of like imagination and creation that we do together when we get into space together. And I think that's so much of what we talked about today and what the three of you brought to the table demonstrated, that the work that we do when we get together actually creates this notion of truth that is multiple, that is layered, that is complex, and that can make space for the kind of transitions that we want to see. So with that, we have about 10 minutes for audience Q&A. Does anyone, do we do the mics for audience Q&A? Does anyone want to start it off?
I'd like to hear from all of you about your experiences with the urban-rural divide. And there's so many other topics that you guys have brought up that in one way I can see like, yes, this is totally commonplace here. It is unheard of in, like, I'm from Iowa, and there's like tiny, like the tiniest little towns where it's like your grandpa's cousin is still like running the show in terms of culture or whatever, and it can be like heinously bigoted. And it feels like so does anyone have any thoughts about that? I realize we're in New York City, but there's tiny towns just a stone's throw away, and I feel like obviously the internet and access to it help. It can be evil, but that's the great beauty of it, is that we're not isolated from each other, even if we are in small remote.
I can share that I grew up in a very small town in Northern California called Redding. It's about 2 hours north of Sacramento. Very suburban, but there are like farms. I didn't grow up on a farm. But I grew up in a predominantly white town, and my experience of being a child of an immigrant family, my family faced a lot of racism, and we didn't have resources. Like, I didn't want to be out in high school because I knew I would be made fun of. And so that's why I knew when I moved away for college, I wanted to go to a big city where there would be a thriving queer and trans community. So like, I speak about like migration for survival because my parents, they met in LA. They were living in a large city, but it was too expensive for them to stay in LA. So then they moved to San Jose, where I was born, the Bay Area, where there's a lot of Filipino community. But then, even then, it wasn't sustainable for them to stay in San Jose. So that's why we all moved up to Redding, because they were able to buy a home. My dad found a job with the city, and they were able to provide a really great living for me and my siblings. But I guess to speak to your question, I guess, I know a lot of people living with HIV moved to New York because of the resources. I know a lot of trans people moved to New York because of the resources. And it sucks to hear stories about what happens to trans people when they don't have resources, and in like smaller towns when they come from rural areas. And I wish I could be part of doing that work, but for me, I know I need to be in a place for my survival. And I know there will be other people doing that work where it's very much needed.
Think about alliances. Like, so I came from a city, it's called Edmonton, and it's not a small city, but it's not a big city. And what happens there is, like, if I met another gay person whose politics weren't shit, I just stayed friends with them forever, even if I didn't like them. You know what I mean? Whereas New York, you're like, ugh, I don't like that guy's jeans and he watches Friends. I don't ever have to talk to him again. And so I think about that in terms of scope and rural-urban divide, like who you have to be friends with, what you have to do to make things go, and sometimes that can be dangerous, and sometimes that can be life-giving, right? I think about that. And I also want to shout out to Joss Barton. She is an amazing poet who lives in St. Louis, and she got a grant from the St. Louis Art Council so she could run like a 3-day workshop for trans poets, specifically femme trans poets in the Missouri area, and she prioritized people living with disabilities, and like the money that she got went towards it was trans women of color with disabilities who are poets, and she put the money going towards like Uber and food and good teachers, and then they created a zine and they keep together in context. So I just wanted to say that there's probably lots of examples of amazing people doing this work, but Joss Barton is one of them. Yeah.
I think, as you point out, there is a bit of a divide. Of course, even in a liberal city like New York, there are absolutely people who are not so supportive. So, you know, one has to be careful about, yes, we live in a bubble, but not completely. And I am amazed by the phone calls I get from places like Western Virginia, where my cousin is a Episcopalian minister, priest,
I didn't pay attention.
Wiccan, I don't know. Okay, so anyway, and you know, so she sends, I do these phone calls. There are people like in her parish who have come out, and I get these phone calls, you know, tell me about my kid, and how to support my kid, and it's there can be some really amazing stuff going on. And then my other just quick story is, I know there's a project afoot at Mount Sinai in the adult CTMS, the Adult Transgender Medicine Program, looking at telemedicine. So since so much of what I do is based upon history, right? You know, I ask you, are you feeling sick? I ask you, are you doing well? I ask you about your meds. I ask you about your allergies. There's a lot of history, right? There's actually very little that my stethoscope will help me with. That's just the nature of the kind of work as an outpatient I do. And so this acknowledgement that some of this is history, which means I don't have to be in the same room as you for much of what I do. And they are starting to develop a program where people literally can call in, do FaceTime, have an evaluation with the doctor, go to the local LabCorp, whatever it is. These labs aren't terribly exciting, much of what I do, much of the ones that I order. They could be for anything. And so you can do a lot of this very privately, but long distance. So I think there is some interesting things that are going to break down some of the, you know, rural-urban divide. So.
Other audience questions? Are these separate questions?
Sure. So this is, I mean, it kind of builds off what you were just saying about, you know, telemedicine, and what you were saying earlier about, like, in your waiting room and your clinic. Like, kind of what I heard is the idea of, like, making the doctor's office like an affirming space, you know, and, like, it can be really intimidating and you know, not necessarily foster, like, asking questions, and particularly I think for, like, queer and trans youth, like you were saying as well, it's like, you know, they might not have family resources or things like that. So like a doctor sort of as an advocate, you know, and someone who can help, you know, a kid like make informed decisions about themselves. I think that's really great. So this is kind of for everyone, I guess, like building off of that, you know, do you see places within the medical community where there's like fostering, you know, that among doctors? Like, you know, leading by example is great, but like what are other opportunities for us that we can do to kind of influence that or like, yeah, I don't know. What do we see going forward?
I mean, yes, waiting rooms are incredibly intimidating, and I get that. They just are. There is a lot of things happening. The American Academy of Pediatrics has a very robust section on LGBT advocacy, and those folks are going to Capitol Hill. The local chapter is going to Albany all the time, and those are physicians who are, you know, taking the day off to do a lot of that sort of stuff. There are things happening. The AAP is just one organization. The Society for Adolescent Health and Medicine is another one. Physicians for Reproductive Health is another one. I happen to like that one a lot. And there are things. Now, how lay people get involved with some of those organizations, I'm not really sure. I think there are lay people organizations, PFLAG, things like that. Some of the what I've been told, some of the power is, well, when you've got a doctor who's taken the day off and I mean, as stupid as it sounds, you wear your white coat. I don't wear it except for these sorts of things. You bring your stethoscope around your neck, you know, and you show up in some, you know, congressman's office. That apparently has a lot of power. So hopefully more and more people will do that. And that's how change happens.
I have an example. On Friday, to your point, New York is full of resources, and one of the resources is a lot of AIDS organizations or organizations that deal with people living with HIV have what they would call like a consumer board, or like people who use the resources and they get called consumers, and that's another panel. And and a group of consumers said that stigma is one of the biggest problems facing people accessing services in New York City, especially if someone is an active drug user, especially if they are living with HIV, and especially if they are trans. And so this group of people worked with the New York City hospitals and a different organization whose name I'm forgetting, and they put together the Stigma Summit. And it was providers and people who access services all together in a room. And there were all these panels, and it wasn't just like the drug user panel and then the HIV panel and then the trans panel. Every panel was like a mix of folks and people obviously living at those intersections. And that was really amazing. And the best part of it actually was listening to people living long-term with drugs, or living long-term as trans, or living long-term with HIV. And we've talked lots about youth in this room, which is very important, but I also don't want to forget, like, this room, this building, this city is like also built on people who've been living and enduring and surviving and thriving for a long time. And so that's a little bit of the answer too. It's like, how do we empower each other to tell each other more stories so that young people don't have to feel like they're making it up on their own, or doctors don't have to, or the people at the front desk don't have to be making it up on their own? How can we like circulate information better? Like, yeah. There was another question, right? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, I mean, I was going to talk more about later. I agree. I think like our generation can look to history and people who have been doing this work for a very long time to do better work.
And we should talk to the people that are like the loudest. Like, something that I learned a lot or thought about a lot this summer is like Sylvia Rivera is someone we say her name all the time, but she probably wasn't a likable person, and she probably got kicked out of lots of places, right? So who are we being crappy to that actually holds the key to our liberation? And so I think about that in terms of who gets to pass down information. Like, rule followers don't pass on great information. Rebel rousers have lots of skills.
Do we have time for more questions? Okay. Do you want to ask your question?
Oh, yeah. My question was very similar to your question, actually. So I was really struck by your story about being one of two trans people of color in a room of probably a lot of people that were making decisions about your direct lived experience. So I'm always really interested in how like conversations like this, which are very inherently rooted in community, that are happening in parallel with sort of conversations that may be isolated happening within a larger system of power. So I guess I'm just curious to all the panelists, like, what is a good model you've seen that integrates sort of community with system in a way that isn't like sensationalizing or tokenizing and like, hey, cool, we have the one person who is gonna now be like the onus on you to tell us sort of what your lived experience is that we may or may not listen to, but check like you were in the room sort of thing. So just wondering, have you seen or experienced things that you feel like are showing up for it and doing it well, or where should we be going?
Thank you for that. Yeah. Last week, Thursday and Friday, I went through a 2-day training around undoing racism. And they went through a lot of history, but a lot of the main purpose of the training is like, how do we undo racism within our organization? And if folks don't know about Callen-Lorde, it's a very diverse organization. I've never worked at an organization where I've worked with so many other trans staff members. But there is still racism there. And I think, we just looked at our organization critically at like, what does our top level executive leadership look like? And it's mostly white, cis people, and quite a few straight people too at a queer organization. And I guess where I'm going with this is yeah, like, I do work externally with the community, but also like the work needs to be done internally as well. And so whether that's calling out racist coworkers or just like really problematic coworkers who are cisgender and think they know what's best for trans people. Another example was we were case conferencing a patient who's struggling with social isolation and who has a lot of social anxiety and doesn't want to integrate into the community. And these providers were talking about this young trans person with just like a place of concern, while there were trans staff members in the room who were like, well, this is like, we experience this on a daily basis. And how do we tell them like, okay, we get the concern, but also like, this is a process, and like, why not just let the trans people do that work?
So when I was at seminary, there was a group of us who wanted to increase people's awareness of HIV in the seminary, and we contacted Positive Women's Network, which is an organization of women living with HIV, and we're like, do you want to come and do a training? We have a budget. And to this woman named Olivia Ford's credit, she was like, listen, none of the membership wants to come and tell their sob stories to a bunch of people that might not take any action. We want to come, and we're happy for the resources. Can we do something creative with you? And we're like, yes. And what they did is 3 women from Positive Women's Network came and to the room. So we promoted the event. We said a conversation with Positive Women's Network, and it was called Have You Been Vulnerable Today? And what the event was the women from Positive Women's Network asked the audience the questions. They were like, you think that we're interesting, so if you think that we're interesting, then you'll trust that our questions will take you to really interesting places. And these questions were all about vulnerability, and they ended up being this really beautiful sharing. And what we saw happen was the audience was put in the position of telling their stories instead of just like passively taking someone else's story. They had to think that they're a body too, and it was just really powerful. So I think that's one example.
I mean, I guess I can only really say that I'm a big fan of and believer in diversity in the workplace, that I think a multitude of different opinions is important. It is sometimes hard to get that, as somebody who's been recruiting for a few, who's seen staff turnover at an organization. It is sometimes hard to keep a diverse staff, and yet I think that is still a goal of ours, and the programs that I touch, it is in the back of my mind about that. But having a fully integrated, diverse workforce continues to be a challenge, I think, even for organizations as liberal as and as progressive as Callen-Lorde, and certainly as not always so progressive Mount Sinai, is a challenge for all of us.
Yeah, to that point, I want to mention that I think it's really important to think about why it's difficult to keep organizations diverse, and like why people that are people of color or people that are trans or people that are queer might feel like they can't work at an organization anymore. And like for people that are working at the organization to come together and be like, what can we do to make this a space that is not only safe for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, safe for queer and trans people, safe for people that don't have class privilege, and safe for people that aren't necessarily able-bodied, and so on and so forth. Like, what can we do to not only make it safe, but also make it a space where like people can like take on leadership roles and shape the space and things like that. Should we do one more question, or should we close out?
One more.
Okay, one more question. Who's gonna take it? Yeah.
So my question is about how we move beyond thinking about protecting certain like discrimination protections, or thinking about like how we. So for example, the Trump administration has proposed a rule that would basically determine that trans people aren't protected when they currently are protected by the Affordable Care Act. And so a lot of the different approaches that advocates and activists have been using is to maintain what we already have, or to protect the current protections that we have, right? And so all of the mental approaches are all based off of like, how do we like safeguard things that already exist, or how do we like make sure that attacks are minimized? And that leaves very little room for how we can be imaginative and envision like some more positive approaches that like generate new worlds or new healthcare systems. So my question is like for each of the panelists, particularly Malaya, what would you envision in like maybe 10 years what a perfect healthcare system would be, or what health would mean to human beings in decades from now?
That's my sister, by the way. Damn, it's a really great question. As you were asking the question, I think, I mean, I can't help but keep thinking about community and just grassroots efforts. Like that's where the most work happens. And that's where I see the most like true liberation. I can speak to, I mean, it's like everything that's happening right now for trans care. Like I'm gonna just give credit to the Black trans community for just leading the movement and for always finding ways to work the system to our advantage. And I say that with like having seen it, and it's innovative and it's creative and it's just how we need to survive. And I don't think we need to another like big thing I gathered from the Undoing Racism training is like these systems that have been created for us, or they're not created for us. They have been created to oppress us. And like over time, you just see like history repeats itself. And so it's like we there's, I think, an Audre Lorde quote, like, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And I really butchered that, but I think like it speaks to like we can't think within what systems we have currently. Like we ideally, so to answer your question, I wish I could just say I think we should have universal health care, but I also don't, just from knowing the cis hetero like white supremacist systems at play, I know that they will always find a way to make it profitable and make it capitalistic. And so I think even if we had universal healthcare, like we're always going to have issues. But I think it's a matter of like, how do we listen to the most oppressed and marginalized people in communities, and how do we center their voices? How do we let them lead us to solutions? And I wish people would continue doing that. I think people try their best, but it doesn't always work out.
I will agree that universal health care is probably a huge solution, part of the solution. I tend to think of, you've all seen the picture of a fence, and beyond the fence is a baseball game, and all these kids of different heights are trying to look over the fence to look at the baseball game, and each one of them has a box. They're all standing on different sized boxes so that they all end up just able to look over the fence at the baseball game. And so I would like to think that in the future, the work that we do is that box. It's individual to the person, so that you're trying to provide them with enough assistance to help create a level playing ground. Now, what that looks like, obviously, is very individual to individual persons, but I think that sort of framework of equalizing healthcare in the very broad sense of the term is important. Single payer, fair prices for medications, fair prices for procedures, having honest discussions about the healthcare that we have in this country, blah, 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 blah. But that's how I would answer that.
I'm reading a book right now about the early days of the water protectors and the camps that were set up, and how and those camps to me seem like a really good model for what I want healthcare to look like. It was about shared duties and compassion, and it was about broadening the definition of what medicine is, so that culture is medicine, language is medicine, pills are medicine. And to me, the future is a more holistic approach to healthcare and a broadening of what it is to be an expert. And so let's use HIV for an example. There's somebody who can help you figure out how much medication you should be taking, like what pill you should be taking. But there's also somebody who's helping you figure out what are the other therapies that you need to be well in this world. There's an amazing activist organization called Vocal New York. And they say the most powerful thing that I can think of is we can end the AIDS crisis tomorrow without a cure. And so in the answer to your question, I think we can end the Medicare crisis like now through deconstructing things that don't work and figuring out the things that do work.
I think that's a great end to this panel that has already been amazing. Thank you so much to all of the panelists. Thank you to everyone here for sharing space with us and like creating community in this room tonight. And also thank you to Creative Time for organizing it.
I feel like I don't really need to close out because you just did a miraculous job. On behalf of Creative Time, I wanted to say thanks again to you, Tai Jacob, to Malaya Mañacop, sorry for the first time, Dr. John Steever, Ted Kerr. This has been a real privilege for me to be in this space with you all and having this conversation. I hope that everyone got something out of it. I want to remind everyone that this was our last conversation until the main stage, which is November 14th through 16th. right here in New York, so I hope to see everyone there. There's some food left over in the back, so please feel free to fellowship with us, continue this conversation for a few minutes before we have to get out of this space, so Richard and his team can do what they do here at the center. But if you have any questions about tonight's conversation, Creative Time, or the summit in general, we'd be happy to chat with you in the back of the room. Thanks so much.